Father Peter Heers is an old friend of mine. We studied together in Thessaloniki, and we even had the same doctoral dissertation advisor. Father Peter is a man of many talents and involved in many endeavors. He started Divine Ascent Journal in the 1990s and currently owns and runs Uncut Mountain Press. Father Peter has taught at Holy Trinity Seminary in Jordanville, New York, and most recently he was the headmaster of Three Hierarchs Academy in Florence, Arizona. I'm always glad for the opportunity to spend some time with Father Peter, and he was recently in town and graciously agreed to sit down with me for this interview. So without further ado, I hope you'll enjoy this episode from my interview with Father Peter Heers.
Well, the short answer would be, of course, the grace of God and the presence of the holy and the sanctified in the Orthodox Church. But the long answer would be that in 1992, after 28 years of Anglican service, my father was an Anglican priest, and his parish became Orthodox after meeting an Orthodox priest who had converted in 1988, among the big group that came in, the evangelicals. And he was in the Bay Area, where my folks were, met with my father, and slowly the parish came in. And I was away at the University of Wisconsin, and so my mother called me up and said, "Oh, we're becoming Orthodox." And I said, "What's that?" I never really thought about it. Even though my grandfather is from Greece, came over from a young age to America in the 1910s. He married a German, and they compromised and went to the Anglican Church. Back in the day, probably wasn't many Orthodox churches around. So my mother was raised in Anglican. So this was something new to me, but in a way it was something old for us. So I went to a Greek church, a little quaint parish in Madison, Wisconsin. And I remember distinctively that I had this feeling that I was going into another world, and when I closed the door, I was going back into the previous one. It was a really intense feeling of the holiness and the presence of God, even though externally it was very simple. There was an old lady, it was a Vesper service on Saturday, an old lady, a priest, and a chanter, and I didn't understand much. It was probably mostly in Greek. And but simply the presence of God in the temple of God was overwhelming. And I had already left the Anglican Church for the most part, been going to the Roman Catholic Church. I met a lot of traditional Roman Catholics and was doing pro-life work, activist work on the campus there. But I had never experienced anything like the presence of God in the Orthodox Church. And so I think I converted immediately in my heart, but then I had intellectually to justify it to myself and to everyone around me. And so I had to start to read. And what was interesting is I read the first book that someone gave me was not usually the book that people give to inquirers. It was Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future by Father Seraphim Rose. And anybody who's read that book knows that this assumes a lot of the reader. But what it made a huge impression on me and also really helped me to immediately embrace Orthodoxy was that I felt that the writer and the church and the witness of the church and the fathers had a very thorough understanding of the demonic and the demons. And I said, well, if they understand the demons, then they must have the truth. And they explain so much of the spiritual world. And later I would discover in the writings of Father Seraphim Rose that one of the key distinctions or what makes Orthodoxy the church is that they have the discernment of the spirits. That's precisely what makes Orthodoxy different than everything else. So I would say that, in a nutshell, that's how I became Orthodox. I think that the thing that most converts in the Orthodox Church in America and the Western world need to do is after they've ran the gamut of the horizontal level, learning about Christ, about the Church, about its history, being convinced of the truth of the Church, they need to stop and go deeper. And that means they need to begin to live the spiritual life in the Church. They need to begin to have a spiritual father and do obedience and struggle against the passions. They need to go from thinking about Christ to encountering Him and loving Him and accepting Him. And that's what many converts don't make much progress on. For a variety of reasons, they don't have a lot of examples. That's the biggest problem in America, I think, is that the examples are few. I mean, of saints, of holy people, of monasteries. And so it's hard to acquire the Orthodox ethos without examples. The Orthodox ethos is the way of being Christ, right? We embrace the truth, and it seems like that is everything compared to the falsehood or delusion that we had outside of the church. But really, that's just the beginning. That's the beginning of then intellectually we've acquired it, but now we have to put it, assimilate it into our thoughts, words, deeds, impulses, glances, decisions, desires. Everything that is beyond just the rational intellect we have to become Christ-like. We have to go from the image to the likeness, and this is, of course, a whole life's journey. But we have to begin, and I would say that for a new convert, that's the most important, to move on to that stage as quickly as possible. That presupposes that we have a guide. It presupposes that we are living an intense spiritual life in the church, meaning confession and communion. So I would say that this is where they need to focus and to acquire that ethos. And without that ethos, the whole point of the dogmatic surety and the truth and the confession is lost. That's supposed to lead to that. Like, we say the creed, and that's the boundaries, let's say, of the church. We put those boundaries around, but then we have to live in the house of the Father, and we have to make that spiritual life a reality, and it's very different. And that takes trust, right? We have the faith we confess, but that's not yet spiritual life, right? Accepting that faith is not yet the spiritual life. One could be in church every Sunday and yet really have no personal experience of the grace of God, and not have the trust in God that is so important. So to make progress in that, it cannot be done without humility and obedience. These are the keys. And of course, one has to increase the prayer. The prayer of Jesus, the Jesus prayer, which is so at the heart of our spiritual life and of the Hesychast tradition, needs to be cultivated. And I see that there's maybe a lot of hesitation on people's part. They don't know, they're ignorant, or spiritual fathers are hesitant to go there. I think as long as that's the case, one cannot make much progress, because the remembrance of God all throughout the day is absolutely essential if you're going to make progress in acquiring the ethos, the way of Christ. And that begins in the early hours of the morning with the Jesus prayer, and it goes throughout the day with the remembrance of God and the Jesus prayer. Now, there's other ways to do that in the ancient church and the Desert Fathers. They didn't necessarily have the Jesus prayer; they would have the Psalter. But what is essential is the remembrance of God at all times, unceasingly. And the tradition has given us this hesychastic center is what is at the center of the church, and so we have to embrace that. So as long as converts remain on the horizontal plane, or as long as they remain without a real struggle to acquire the prayer, then I think the spiritual life will continually be elusive for them, and the grace of God will not come in abundance. So I think that's where they need to focus.
Hi again, hope you enjoyed this episode from my interview with Father Peter Heers. Please subscribe to get notified when new videos become available. And if you enjoy the content on this channel, please consider supporting it. There's a link to the support page on our website below this video. Thanks so much, and have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.